we going to arrive? There are shellings everywhere. There's some kind of base there. Well, there are positions all over Crimea.
On August 8th, something terrible started in Crimea.
This is fucked up.
Ukrainian Neptunes attacked 3 nuclear airfields in Crimea. Everything is burning.
No way, absolutely no way. No, there's just no way at all. Not even a little bit.
Boom. Bang. Quiet, quiet, quiet. Are you filming? Yeah. Unbelievable. There were explosions in Sevastopol, Simferopol, and Yevpatoria, in the Bakhchisarai district, Alushta, Feodosia, Saki, and Novofedorivka. No way! The airfields Saki, Gvardeyske, and Kirovsky are on fire.
Now that's an explosion. That's a firework.
The Ukrainian armed forces have launched powerful special operations in Crimea to destroy Russian military personnel. Nuclear triad. The Black Sea Fleet, airfields, and oil refineries are under attack.
That's right.
Damn, they hit the train station.
Let's fly, fuck your mother. Give the command.
Crimea burned last night. 4 key military airfields were attacked. Where does the strategic nuclear industry take off from?
That's fucked up.
Saki, Gvardeyskaya, Kirovskaya. Strike against aviation. 200 drones attacked Crimea last night. The targets of the drones were the Saki, Gvardeyskaya, and Kirovskaya airfields. NASA satellites recorded a massive fire near the Gvardeyskaya airfield in Crimea. At the Crystal Oil Depot in Engels, another fuel tank caught fire. The whole city is covered in smoke. As they say, the show must go on, or in other words, the commotion at the Crystal Oil Depot in Engels has been going on for several days now. Meanwhile, Russia has lost another Su-25. Special Operation Forces destroyed a decision-making center in the Kherson direction. And also, the headquarters of the Russian forces in Makivka was attacked and blown up. We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Wishing everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, let's start with the hell in occupied Crimea, because more than 200 drones attacked 3 key military airfields, Gvardeyskoye, Saki, and Kirovskoye. Novofedorivka was also attacked. The floor is yours.
Novofedorivka is a depot near Saki, so basically it's a single complex, Novofedorivka and the Saki airfield. Today's strike on Crimea was truly large-scale, the kind we've repeatedly called for, let's put it mildly, on air, because we kept circling around Crimea but never actually touched it. It was kind of a sacred cow, so to speak. Honestly, today was a well-executed, solid attack. Really, 200 drones can overwhelm any air defense system, any at all. Thanks to the large number of decoys, the Russian forces, at least the air defense units, used up their missiles today, and yet quite significant damage was still inflicted on Russian airfields. In Saki, near Simferopol, and of course near Sevastopol, but the drones also managed to reach Kerch. There are 2 significant airfields located there that are currently being meticulously prepared, I would definitely say, as primary launch sites for new extensive batches of Geran 2 and Geran 3 drones. And these 2 particular airfields were also recently attacked, at least as of this very moment. The operation was well thought out, excellently executed, and most likely it was carried out by our army. In other words, this is not a special operation. Most likely it's the work of the army. One could even say that this is already under the leadership of Madyar, who has just assumed the position of the new commander of unmanned systems forces. Although in reality, it should be our sailors working in Crimea, that is the Navy, the naval forces. Within the naval forces, there should be their own Madyar, their own sailor Madyar, who will create unmanned systems forces specifically focused on maritime operations, underwater, surface, and aerial for the liberation of Crimea. If today's attack is not a one-off but systematic, then believe me, by the end of the year, at least half of the Russians in Crimea will simply disappear, just vanish. Because if this happens every day, even with just 100, even 100 drones targeting airfields first, definitely. Why airfields? The Russians use airfields in several ways. First, as bases for tactical or army aviation. That means airplanes and helicopters. Second, they use the airfield grounds to deploy anti-aircraft missile systems and radar units of the Russian Federation's radio-technical troops. And third, they use almost all airfields as transit depots for transferring ammunition. That's why for us it's especially important first and foremost to destroy the airfields and everything on them, airfield technical equipment, vehicles, ammunition, and of course the aircraft themselves.
Roman Grigorievich, I wanted to talk to you about aviation. And in the meantime, dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, let us know what you think about the successful operations of the Ukrainian armed forces and about the idea that Crimea should be burning, military targets that is, and that Russians should be swimming back to Russia, whether it's breaststroke or freestyle. Roman Grigorievich, can we assume that at these airfields that were attacked last night, enemy aircraft were also targeted, or did we only strike the fuel facilities there? What do you think?
Well, Russian aircraft are not stationed at all of those airfields right now. They have mostly pulled back to the central and western airfields. The eastern airfields in Crimea. That's why some of the airfields are used by the Russians either for army aviation, for helicopters, for forward operating bases, so-called forward operational airfields, or for deploying anti-aircraft missile systems and radio technical troops. So for us, this is very important in order to deliver serious strikes against Russian aviation. But to do that, we first need to achieve air superiority. That process begins with the destruction of ground-based surveillance and response systems, meaning those same anti-aircraft missile complexes. That's exactly what has started today. The thing is, several times now such operations have started, but then they were cut short. It's as if by the wave of a magic wand. How many times have we talked about this? Well, here it is, the beginning, and then suddenly it stops again for a month and a half, 2 months, and no one even glances at Crimea, at least not sideways. Well, now I'm just afraid to be wrong again. If this is the beginning of Crimea's liberation, then these kinds of attacks should happen every night. Every night, 100 drones should be flying into Crimea.
As for the SBU Special Operation Novorossiysk and also the missile carriers, we see that during massive missile attacks, missile carriers go out into the Black Sea. As far as I understand, they hide them in Novorossiysk and bring them out to sea on the necessary days. The question is, how can we attack all the missile carriers today so that the Black Sea fleet ceases to exist?
Well, they have up to 100 ships and submarines left. Both submarines, there are 4 of them, and surface ships are missile carriers. Well, at least as carriers of caliber missiles. The submarines mainly carry 4 caliber missiles in their torpedo tubes, while the ships can have 4, 6, or even 8. Well, it depends on what kind of launcher is installed. A few months ago, our prominent banking company, working closely together with our Saudi partners, formally pledged not to strike Russian oil refineries, the entire Russian oil industry, and also the significant Black Sea fleet. That's why they now feel right at home, as they say, at least in the eastern waters of the Black Sea. So here, first of all, the question is for the politicians, but actually it's not even for the politicians anymore. Now it's a question for the security services. Why haven't they yet arrested for treason those politicians who ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector and the Russian Black Sea fleet? The Russians leave the base, say Novorossiysk, and go out to sea only to avoid being hit. That is, when they enter the base, it's a compact area with a high concentration of Russian ships, so they leave to avoid being targeted, and then naturally they return mainly for maintenance purposes.
If we analyze whether Ukrainian special services could carry out something similar, but only on Russian territory, do our capabilities match theirs? Let's discuss this.
Well, from a military standpoint, the preparation and execution of the operation were at the highest level. Special services were involved, including Mossad and several other Israeli intelligence agencies, plus the Air Force. Again, pay attention, the main thing here is the Air Force, meaning long-range strike capabilities. 200 fighter jets or various types of aircraft took off and struck previously identified targets. Moreover, the air defense systems had been practically neutralized beforehand by a Mossad special operation. So it was a combined attack, well thought out, well prepared, and well executed. But that's from a military perspective. It's like if we were now discussing how sharp the executioner's axe was when he beheaded some king. Well, yes, it was sharpened well, no doubt about that. The question is, why was there a need to behead at all? That's a different question, a different aspect altogether. The fact is, Israeli strikes on Iran at this point would ignite a war in the Middle East, and that would affect us as well. The first impact, at the very least, would be a rise in oil prices. Right now, the price of oil has already increased by more than 10%, and it could go up by as much as 30%. In other words, oil could rebound to $100 per barrel. That means Russia would receive twice as many petrodollars as before. there had been a trend toward lower oil prices, a trend toward a decline in the Russian economy. Now everything is the opposite, a complete turnaround. There will be a rise in oil prices, an increase in revenues for the Russian hydrocarbon sector, and naturally a boost in the production of military equipment, the purchase of ammunition, and the mobilization of new recruits. So the war in the Middle East will hit us very hard through the surge in Russia. And at that very moment when it was necessary to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon sector, our banking cabal shielded Russian oil and gas facilities from strikes by our special services and our army. How can we counteract this? By reactivating the mechanism of Malyok's sanctions and strikes. The most effective sanctions against the Russian oil and gas sector are its complete destruction. All the more so, it's practically begging for it to be destroyed. After all, even Russian partisans are doing this now. Well, we can see how they set fire to forests where Russian oil pipelines run, how they set things on fire, even in what we call the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, which is actually Donar, our so-called green wedge. A refinery was burning there.
Roman Grigorievich, why is it that what can be effectively done to Iran today cannot be similarly done to Russia in the current global climate?
Well, first of all, we simply don't have the means. Believe me, if we had the means, some of our organizations would have done it long ago. We don't have missiles, we don't have ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, even though we should have them since Ukraine is a rocket-producing country. And we don't have missiles. Well, it's both laughable and tragic, really. This is a question for the authorities, for all the authorities. In more than 30 years of our independence, we ended up without missiles during Russian offensive operations. So clearly, this is something only we can do. It's up to us. No one is going to do anything for us, and there's no point in asking anyone. We have to do this ourselves and strike at the Russian leadership, including those who are where? In the Kremlin, the Rubliovka bathhouses and the Kremlin. How long have we been talking about this? 3 years. What should we be? How should we be? And with what should we do it? Strikes on certain Iranian military targets. Well, first of all, nuclear facilities. Well, it's not that easy to reach a nuclear facility. For example, the facility that was attacked by the Israelis is buried more than 50 meters underground. You can't just reach it like that. That's one. And second, above this facility, above the centrifuges, above the reactor and the centrifuges, there is an 8-meter thick layer of concrete. So they really prepared thoroughly there. That's why, in reality, Iran's nuclear facilities weren't actually damaged. Bushehr, the plant runs on Russian fuel, and in that sense, it wasn't touched at all. There are about 5 or 6 Iranian facilities, and for the most part, they only tried to hit one of them, but even then, they only managed to strike from above. Inside, everything kept working as before. The centrifuges keep spinning, so what will Iran's response be? Well, who knows? Especially now since Pandora's box has been opened. In other words, there was a strike on a nuclear facility. So now Iran could retaliate with nuclear waste of the same kind after all. They could take the waste from Bushehr now and with strontium and cesium cover Israel. Then, as far as I know, with cesium, you wouldn't be able to live there for 24,000 years. And if they hit with uranium-235 or uranium-238, one has a half-life of 700 million years and the other 4.5 billion years. So can you imagine what would happen to Israel in that case? So again, who will end up suffering? The Zionists will gossip, they'll flee to the United States, and it will be the ordinary Israelis left behind who will have to deal with the radiation. These are things that simply cannot be allowed. Strikes on nuclear facilities are absolutely unacceptable by definition. There are certain international monitoring mechanisms, like the IAEA, and it has been granted access there in some areas. Recently, the extension of the 2015 agreement was almost ready, again under IAEA supervision together with the Europeans. That's why the Israelis carried out a preemptive strike, solely to preempt the agreement with Europe and the IAEA. In other words, they didn't give Iran the opportunity to sign this agreement. If the agreement had been in place, as it was from 2015 to 2018, the IAEA would have had full oversight over all stages of uranium enrichment. And so now the Israelis have created, or rather, to be more precise, the Israelis have created a problem for ordinary Israeli citizens. And what will the response be? Well, it's hard to say right off the bat, but Iranians are not a simple people either, believe me. There are significantly more of them, at least in terms of numbers. And no one is going to forgive things like this. So ahead lies a serious bloody war, which for us, it's a negative development. It hasn't brought us any positives and it won't. Why? Because the Shaheds that everyone talks about, the Iranian ones and so on, are actually the Chinese Sunflower 200. The Russian Geran is not an Iranian Shahed. The Russian Geran is the Chinese Sunflower 200. No matter how many military facilities you destroy in Iran, the Russians have been assembling the Chinese Sunflower 200 from Chinese parts and calling it Geran, and they'll keep doing so. If you're going to call for strikes on the main factories and production sites, then they should be Chinese ones. What are the Israelis going to fly to China to destroy Chinese factories? Our intelligence agencies should be the ones doing this. These are questions for our intelligence agencies.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Dear audience, please like this video. Let us know what you think in the comments. We're returning to our main topic, Russian aggression, the war Russia is waging against Ukraine. Roman Grigorievich, regarding the oil depot, for example, another fuel tank caught fire at the Crystal oil depot in Engels. The whole city is covered in smoke. Essentially, drones attacked the oil depot on the night of June 5th to 6th, but the fire still hasn't been put out. Let's evaluate this situation.
Well, first of all, this isn't just an oil depot, or rather, it's not an ordinary oil depot. There are thousands of such oil depots in Russia, if we're talking about oil depots in general. In reality, these are the fuel and lubricants storage facilities of the Engels 2 backup aviation airfield. And it's precisely in this capacity that it is very important to us. This is a supply depot, the main base and primary storage for aviation kerosene. It's underground, located in karst caves and caisson reservoirs. In other words, just try to get there. It's not easy, but there are tens of thousands of tons of kerosene stored there. So from this underground reservoir, the fuel is pumped into the supply base, into the crystal, and then, well, the base or the fuel and lubricants depot, what we call the fuel and lubricants depot. From there, it goes to refuel those same aircraft. And the point that was chosen was correct, where at least the main flow could be cut off. Of course, they also have a backup option where they can refuel directly from the caissons. But I think we'll get to those as well. So the strike on this fuel and lubricants depot was excellently executed, precisely calculated. We discussed with you before how the attack was carried out. They broke through the Russian air defense head-on using a large number of decoy drones, and the strike drones got through, took out the target, and set 3 storage tanks on fire right away immediately. And until it burns out completely, this won't stop. Kerosene is an interesting product. You can actually use it to put out a fire. If you take a bucket of kerosene and pour it on a fire, it goes out. But it's the kerosene vapors that burn. And if you heat kerosene up to a certain temperature and then ignite the vapors, just like what happened when our drones struck, then it's almost impossible to put it out. And in fact, they don't even try to extinguish it. They just move aside, dig a trench around it, and watch until it all burns out. And until everything there has burned out, it will keep burning. It can keep burning for another month.
Roman Grigorievich, today's news, Russia has lost another Su-25.
Well, most likely these losses are due to technical issues. The Su-25s are already 40 years old. They've been flying since the Afghan war, since the 1980s. They were good machines, even excellent for their time when they were built. A good attack aircraft. But now they're old, really old grandpas, I would say. And technologically, of course, they're falling apart. And there aren't that many left when you can only make 1 out of 2 or 3. So this fleet of aircraft is dwindling for the Russians. And even as they keep crashing, like today when a Russian plane was lost.
Roman Grigorievich, over the past 2 days, we've also been attacking the Moscow region. There were military targets there. Roman Grigorievich, what exactly was attacked near Moscow in these last few days? Because the drones didn't reach Moscow itself, but explosions were heard in the Moscow suburbs. They say these were military targets.
Approximately 30% of Russia's advanced high-tech military production capabilities are significantly concentrated within the bustling metropolis of Moscow and its surrounding expansive Moscow region. Therefore, a substantial 1/3 of this crucial production is located specifically in Moscow and the broader Moscow region. And that's why it's so important for us to break through, to push past the Russian air defenses. It's very difficult to do this because there are at least 2 barrier detachments in place. The first is the frontal air defense. It's very hard to break through. That's in the Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk regions, which are practically packed with air defenses facing toward Moscow. And the second is the site-specific one around Moscow. So sometimes when we see reports that the Russians have shot down 50 or 70 of our drones in the Bryansk and Belgorod regions, that's why. These were headed for Moscow. Mostly they're shooting down decoys that cost a few $100s, while the missile used to shoot them down costs tens of thousands of dollars. But nevertheless, some still get through. For example, there was a strike in the Moscow region on one of the factories that produces circuit boards for electronics. As I said, this is high-tech manufacturing, and at least for now, the technological process has been halted. But in reality, to actually reach Moscow, you need ballistic missiles. In other words, without ballistic missiles, we won't be able to break through Moscow's air defense for specific targets. Drones won't be able to get through it.
Roman Grigorievich, in the Moscow region, in Zubovo, a microelectronics factory was attacked. There's a hole in the roof. The factory in Zubovo is a production complex that is part of the Rezonit Technopark in the Moscow region. It specializes in manufacturing printed circuit boards and electronic components for various industries, including the defense industry. So, about this.
That's exactly what I was talking about, yes. So they hit Rezonit directly, the technological cycle has been halted. That's the most important thing. But it can only be destroyed with ballistic missiles. Well, even if a drone carries 50 kilograms, it won't be able to completely disable any military facility.
Roman Grigorievich, from a military standpoint, how many years would it take for Ukraine to have ballistic missiles? Not just a few, of course, but in mass production, so that it would be, how many years? 1,000 missiles a year? If we take examples from other countries that produce ballistic missiles?
Well, the thing is, Ukraine is a missile-producing country. Back in the Soviet Union, we produced several types of missiles with a full production cycle, starting from air-to-air missiles to the Kh-35A or Kh-35U ship-launched missiles, from which the Neptune was developed. By the way, that's an aircraft-launched anti-ship missile. So a ship-launched missile from the air, well, we produced it entirely, the full production cycle. There were several other missiles of this kind as well. And ballistics, we produced ballistic missiles. These are cruise missiles, if you can call them that. The Kh-35U in particular was already at this level. And as for ballistics, we produced intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Satan SS-18, yes, produced by our Yuzhmash plant. That's 11,000 kilometers in range, which means it could reach as far as Beijing and Pyongyang. So we have preserved this entire technological chain, the technical documentation, the production system, very important mechanisms, for example, certain testing procedures, test stands, and of course, the engineering staff. We were manufacturing there 10 years ago. We launched the Grom-C, a whole complex that we produced with the help of a $100 million investment from Saudi Arabia, and we sold it to them as well. So this was just a few years ago. In other words, we have the entire production base for manufacturing ballistic missiles. It's not like we're starting from scratch. In order to launch, say, serial production of those same Grom missiles with a range of 500 kilometers, we would need somewhere around $150 to $200 million and about a year and a half to 2 years. So if this government had started this 6 years ago, by now we could have launched serial production of the Grom missiles 3 times over, for one thing. If at this point we don't have the Grom missile, and we don't because otherwise it would have long since hit Moscow, then it means that for 6 years, this government has just been dragging its feet. That's a big problem. The executive branch should have been sent to the armed forces of Ukraine a long time ago. I've said it so many times already, the executive branch needs to be deshmichaelized. You don't need elections or re-elections for that. This is in accordance with our constitution, in accordance with the legal framework of our laws to change the executive branch. Shmihal's team just can't handle it. They absolutely can't handle it. Umarov, Shmihal, and all the rest of that Shmihal crowd, they're not in the right positions. They need to be replaced with professionals who know how to quickly launch a program, like the ballistic one, or how to restructure the country's economy for wartime. But that's an entire process. The work should be done by military personnel with a basic military education who also understand economics. We have enough people like that.
Roman Grigorievich, to sum up, Special Operations Forces destroyed a decision-making center of the Rashists in the Kherson direction. The Rashist headquarters in Makivka was also attacked. A video report of the HIMARS MLRS strike was made for the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and everyone wrote that there were many killed and many wounded. The floor is yours.
Well, about Makivka, that's me. I'm from Makivka. I've been saying for a while now, why aren't we hitting their rear positions? So most likely our rocket troops thought so that Svaitin doesn't start cursing and blowing his top. So they went ahead and struck Makivka. The main thing is it was not far from my house. So the combat mission was accomplished, of course. Well done, the range allows it. We have the means to strike. HIMARS work well at that range, and naturally in Kherson on the so-called southern front as well. There's some serious Russian activity going on there right now. They're still at a crossroads. They're deciding where to send the remaining reserves, either to reinforce the Zaporizhia direction, meaning the operations there, or to the right bank of the Dnipro near Kherson. So they still haven't decided yet, because the reserves that could have helped them in either direction, Putin burned through before May 9th, setting, well, unattainable goals. In other words, impossible tasks. So right now, at this moment, you could say we should thank Putin for his complete idiocy in strategic planning, because it's precisely his idiocy, this political trap, that's giving us a breather now. We still have about 2 months before the next wave of reserves arrives. In these 2 months, we can give the Russians a hard time. Well, we'll see what exactly we'll give them a hard time for, and then we'll talk about it in each of our reviews.
Roman Grigorievich, we're already at the end. The Russian armed forces have entered Yablonivka in the Sumy region, according to Deep State. That's 26 kilometers from the regional center. The gray zone has also expanded in Yunakivka, a village at the epicenter of the fighting. Please comment on this, it's very important.
Yablonivka and Yunakivka. Well, yesterday they said they were 20 kilometers from Sumy, and now it's already 26 kilometers. So does that mean they're having a negative advance or something? They've fallen back 6 kilometers in the opposite direction. That's about where they are, somewhere between 20 and 30 kilometers. They're stuck there and will keep being stuck in that area. It's a small bridgehead, even from the perspective of just the Sumy region, not to mention all of Ukraine. A small bridgehead that the Russians jumped into on the heels of our retreating troops. That was a mistake made by our own politicians. Earlier, we thanked Putin for his political decision, but here it was our politicians' mistake. They held our troops in offensive positions on the Kursk direction almost to the point of disaster, nearly to catastrophe. Then we had to run because, you see, the politicians wanted to have negotiations with the Saudis from a better position at least. Nothing came of it for them, but we had to flee from the Kursk region. And on the heels of our retreating troops, the Russians rushed into the Sumy region. But I'll say it again, this is about the same level as in the Kharkiv region, around the area of Lipsy, where they are now near Vovchansk. They rushed in and that's it. They got stuck. In the same way, the Russians will be stuck just around Yablonivka, Yanakivka, and so on. But no further. They won't advance any farther. On the one hand, there are serious fortifications there. That's the first thing. Secondly, reserves have now been redirected there, and our troops have already recovered from this strategic failure of our politicians. They've already recovered, and now, in some areas, we're even regaining our previously lost positions, pushing the Russians back and advancing toward the Kursk direction, toward Tetkino, which is nearby to the west. The Russians entered our territory and we entered theirs. It's all just talk.
Friends, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to discuss the military and political situation. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and share your thoughts on Israel's special operation. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Share your location in the comments. Renowned military analyst Roman Svitan, Roman Grigorievich, thank you. And as usual, see you again on Monday.